60s were a kind of scary time for Hollywood. The forces that had ruled Hollywood, that had made Hollywood so successful during the 30s, 40s, 50s, and even into the 60s were ending.
The original moguls that built the industry, the Jack Warners, the Xanax, all these early pioneers were leaving the studios, and the studios were being sold to large corporations.
Production was very, very sparse as far as spending money to make films, and people were looking to get out of it, not get into it.
And to be a film student at that time was to have a little mark of Cain on your forehead, that you were not welcome. Back then, it was very hard to get into the business. The business itself was, some people believed that it was the end of movies as we knew it.
Period of extraordinary change. I've never seen public taste change as quickly.
In fact, 1969 or 1970 was the year of lowest movie attendance ever. David?
Even as television was embracing youth programming, the studios still didn't get it. But Bert Schneider and Bob Rafelson sure did. Flush with money from the success of the Monkees, they knew there was an untapped audience for something different.
The studios were still turning out films like Darling Lily, and they did Paint Your Wagon, where Clint Eastwood and Lee Marvin got to sing. They were all trying to repeat the success of Sound of Music and My Fair Lady with little success, and a lot of the studios were close to bankruptcy.
Some studios were put on the block, a number of executives lost their jobs, and there was a real fear in the executive suites because they weren't at all sure what people wanted to see, particularly what young people wanted to see.
Easy Rider came along in 1969, cost $500,000, made by nobodies, dope, unhappy ending, hippies, long hairs, and cleaned up. It was a huge hit, and it was really a revolution. These old guys in the studios had the foggiest idea of why this film was so successful or what was going on, and all they knew was that there was a guy named Dennis Hopper who directed it. So they grabbed onto the directors as saviors.
Schneider said, I'm going to give you the money to go and shoot this. You shoot it in 16 millimeter. And if I like what I see, then I'll give you the rest of the money to make the, feature movie. So I got 5 friends of mine that had 16 millimeter cameras, all of them who wanted to be directors, in the middle of Mardi Gras, and I was crazy. There's no question about it.
Dennis was just shooting, he's gonna get New Orleans, man, which he did.
We shot for 4 days, and I literally walked people through the streets practically. It was like the Bataan Death March.
Nobody thought that Easy Rider was really going to become a seminal film, though. I thought it was just another bike movie.
And there'd been a lot of dialogue about Easy Rider because they were having all kinds of problems putting it together, and this bunch of hippies had gone out and they were stoned and they made this movie, and it was never going to go together, and they'd spent, $600,000-700,000, whatever it was, and that was kind of the rap on the movie that at least we heard. And then it went out, and it was boffo. It was genuine shock. I don't think that the Hollywood establishment could figure out why anybody was going to see that movie. And that was just, it seems to me that was just as the change was happening. It was Vietnam. It was, long hair was becoming more popular.
They'd lost their audience. They had not addressed their audience. They had not addressed what their audience were into. We'd gone through the 60s and nobody had ever seen drugs smoked without, going out and committing some kind of murder or atrocity of some kind.
When you went to see a movie like Easy Rider, and when you saw these guys really smoking grass by the fire, and really the camaraderie was warm and real and rare, you went, what the hell am I looking at? This has value. This has a completely different kind of value than pillow talk. This is something extraordinary. I want more of that.
The New Hollywood movement was a revolution for American cinema that introduced a new kind of liberation that changed what went on in the films and how it was conveyed. Lasting approximately from 1967 to 1980, its reverberations can be felt to this day as it prioritized the director and put a focus on modernity and realism over extravagance. It seemed this was an age when cinema grew up, with Hollywood making more adult-orientated movies which contained more adult-orientated themes, as well as more violence, sex, drugs, and swearing.
I am the motherfucking Shore Patrol, motherfucker!
The New Hollywood movement was a response to an incredible change in the culture. Although the counterculture had affected music and fashion earlier, particularly in Britain, the film side of things took a little longer to apply, and this change in this medium had been a couple of decades in the making. The old Hollywood system ended in '48 when the Paramount antitrust case resulted in the major movie companies no longer holding exclusive rights to their cinemas, lowering their revenue and influence. Hollywood films sharply declined in the 50s. Cinema attendance had boomed in the post-war era, but dropped over the decades as consumers grew an increasing interest in television instead. Film companies could at least use television to sell film rights to, but that came to an abrupt stop in '68 as television had enough films to broadcast, another big financial blow to these companies. Hollywood competed with television by improving their technology, with most popular films being lavish and expensive productions made up of long-lasting genres like musicals, westerns, biblical films, and war films that were recently joined by popular franchise hits. But they were all having diminishing returns, and even high-grossing films weren't recuperating their ginormous budgets. These financial issues caused these companies to spend less on movie production, but offer more directorial control, which was spent on directors who wanted to more explicitly express their culture than ever before. There was much going on in the culture that made it shift and change so dramatically. Audiences wanted a more liberated cinema, and they got it, with Jack Valenti becoming MPAA president in '66, and he immediately began to loosen some restrictions on the archaic production code. The production code was completely abolished in '68, the MPAA replacing it with a rating system similar to what we have today, which immediately made films more open to sex, drugs, violence, and swearing.
I hate this motherfucking chicken shit eating.
This occurred in the same year the MPAA did a survey and discovered most cinema goers were aged 16 to 24. The American filmmakers of the 70s were very much inspired by the French New Wave filmmakers of the 60s, who they themselves were influenced by American filmmakers of the 40s, and it's from them that the auteur theory was developed, which is what prioritized the director as being the author of their film. These new directors had now grown up with television, and some even experimented with affordable home movie equipment. They either came from a background of TV directing, or from the growing film classes, or they had been apprenticed by Roger Corman, learning the technical details as they made low-budget schlock for his production house. There were a few films that were kicking off this movement, but the three big ones came out within 3 years of each other. Bonnie and Clyde, which depicted a more upfront view on violence and criminal characters, The Graduate, highly aimed at the young adult crowd and their own insular world, and Easy Rider, which took the popular biker genre and elevated it to something that was reflective of the hippie movement as well as the soon-to-be drug culture. Bonnie and Clyde was neglected upon release by its studio Warner Brothers, but it got enthusiastic reviews by the new wave of film critics emerging as well. These films and their immense successes paved the way for others like it. These filmmakers wanted to make films set in modern times about modern topics and with a more modern aesthetic.
The American people are turning sullen. They've been clobbered on all sides by Vietnam, Watergate, the inflation, the depression. They turned off, shot up, and they fuck themselves limp, and nothing helps. So, this concept analysis report concludes the American people want somebody to articulate their rage for them.
Audiences were flocking to European movies like Blow Up, not just because it had very partial nudity, but because it put character and mood over story, being purposefully enigmatic and misleading in a gleeful manner, and also because it had partial nudity. This new young audience went against tradition and now wanted ambiguity in both the narratives and morality of these new films. The filmmakers were now inspired by documentaries and the cinema verite techniques of the French New Wave, so they didn't need to be too fancy. New cameras like the Arriflex and Panaflex were portable and made shooting on location even more practical, meaning less productions to be filmed on sound stages. This caused restrictions for the cinematographers that were channeled into an artistic blessing. This use of locations restricted camera movement, whereas films of previous decades could fill their master shots with characters as well as their surroundings. New Hollywood opted more on close-ups. Cinematographers appeared to be less fussy about lighting, going against the full and bright lighting style of the 50s and embracing the naturalistic shadows of their imagery, best exemplified in a studio film production, The Godfather. but in other films this was a more incidental choice because lighting in real locations was more limited, causing more shadows and darkness. They now looked like color versions of the chiaroscuro lighted 40s noirs, though the cinematography was less constructed. Shooting seemed more off the cuff, with films employing cinema verite techniques from documentaries, such as filming their actors amongst actual events. The jaggedness of this kind of aesthetic had a sense of immediacy that matched the content. Studio-produced films were becoming cheaper to make and still generating a great profit, and independent filmmakers took this new kind of filmmaking liberty to its extremes, transferring their home movie expertise and bringing that rough aesthetic to the big screen. The counterculture of the Western world was being reflected in the films, becoming more ubiquitous in their depiction of sex, drugs, and violence. Influenced by the seeming ubiquity of sex, drugs, and violence in American culture, the first X-rated studio-released film actually managed to become a huge success, becoming the highest-grossing film of the year in the US, and even won the Oscar for Best Picture. After the Civil Rights Act of '64, black representation became more visible in the movies, with black actors playing far more characters rather than just bit players. Sidney Poitier paved the way, becoming the first black actor to earn an Oscar nomination before becoming the most bankable actor in Hollywood in '68. This led to the boom of the blaxploitation genre, which was fronted by Shaft and Sweet Sweetback's badass song. The new Hollywood movies also depicted an uneasiness and ambiguity, particularly in their endings, which was so unlike the Hollywood era before. Stories were no longer nicely tied up, they were mysterious, and uneasy strands still loomed, causing all sorts of other trouble off-screen after the film had ended. The time when the counterculture emerged was also the time when the American public's faith in the government began to dramatically drop, which continued throughout the decade, and the films made sure to reflect that. New Hollywood had not much interest in comforting audiences, but with addressing real-world issues in their own way. By 1972, Columbia lost millions on the kind of big-budget flops that were no longer popular. It seemed big genre movies like historical, fantasy, and sci-fi films weren't as popular as before. The modern-day set disaster movies were the new genre to take that place in Hollywood's more bombastic production value arena. Hollywood was still in a habit of advancing their technology to compete with television. Although it was British musical film Lisztomania that first utilized Dolby Stereo, it was Apocalypse Now that introduced to the cinemas the surround sound experience that is Dolby 5.1. The box office grosses that were at their lowest since the post-war era had in just 3 years now become the highest since the post-war era. Despite New Hollywood arguably hitting a creative high towards the middle of the decade, it was also the time when studios started to regard these grosses over quality content again. The end of the New Hollywood movement had been pondered upon before it began, when in '67 the studios considered the notion of summer blockbusters, which seemed to be a popular moviegoer time when students and workers were on holiday.
It's hard to name any other decade as influential to American cinema as the 70s. The most iconic, groundbreaking, and controversial works of art came from this period. But how?
It was a golden age of filmmaking because we were all single, ambitious, and we were in love with film.
We're going to look at a band of filmmakers who thought they could change the world. And they did.
But first, let's rewind. Because it all starts with Hollywood studios and how they responded to a new threat, TV. People of the 60s could begin to watch complex entertainment in their very own living room. Studios grew insecure of this, and their response was to multiply the spectacle. The introduction of 70mm film and the rise in the epic genre made Hollywood slightly more popular. But an abundance in spending led to a huge problem. The studios were in desperate need of a solution. The weakening of the studios left executives with no options but to let young, unproven talent have projects they normally would not. These projects were completed on bare budgets, but the directors had direct control over their projects. What did the studio care? They hadn't thrown any money into the project anyway. By the late 60s, viewers were treated to films like Bonnie and Clyde, Midnight Cowboy, and Easy Rider. Groundbreaking, controversial films that got more people through the doors of cinemas, including new, younger viewers. Directors were now encouraged to personalize their films as much as possible, leaving their own visual trademarks throughout. Other key characteristics were faster pacing and more experimental camera movement. The complete disregard of archaic rules in favor of experimental techniques was rebellious for the time, and surely left its mark on the future generations of auteurs. Young American filmmakers such as Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, Peter Bogdanovich, Robert Altman, Woody Allen, Steven Spielberg, and George Lucas were watching these films in art cinemas during their formative years as filmmakers. These films gained an audience, especially with young people across the world, for their bold and distinct style, which separated them from the blasé form the medium had fallen into. The elements which would go on to define 70s films were directly influenced by all these factors. Gritty realism, from neo-realism, and cinema verite.
Because we grew up in the cinema verite period of documentary filmmaking, it was a marked influence on how we work.
Rebellious, morally questionable protagonists, a reflection of how people began to question society and politics.
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore!
Violence came as a result of a change in stories. Exploration of urban life and crime families became more rampant. People of the 70s became fascinated by the criminal anti-hero. Violence also became normalized by 70s exploitation cinema. Highly stylized, encouraged by being taught about various international approaches to filmmaking, from Kurosawa in Japan to Godard in France to Sica in Italy. Filmmakers were given the chance to combine all sorts of experimental styles, edgy narratives. The hippie movement, the civil rights movement, free love, the growth of rock and roll, changing gender roles, and drug use certainly had an impact. The counterculture of the time had influenced Hollywood to be freer, to take more risks, and to experiment with alternative, young filmmakers, as old Hollywood professionals and old-style moguls died out, and a new generation of filmmakers arose. It was a time of social stress, and audiences turned to artists for answers. What do you think about women's rights? What do you think about the war? The moment that society turns to artists for answers, great art will emerge. It's just that simple. It just happens. Back then, movies were at the center of the cultural conversation. Now today, a great number of younger people, my children for example, do not think that movies are important. When audiences don't think movies are important, it's very hard to make important movies. That's the difference.
What happened here at Kent State University 50 years ago defined an age.
The guardsmen opened fire on the students.
67 shots. At an anti-Vietnam War protest, 4 dead, 9 injured.
I've never been able to just completely forget it.
Student photographer Howard Ruffner was on the Hill that day. His pictures soon appeared in Life magazine, including this dramatic cover.
I didn't know if he was alive or dead. And you look at him, he doesn't look like he's going to live.
The young man fighting for his life, freshman John Cleary, was shot walking to class.
I was shot in the chest, 1 or 2 inches in one direction. I wouldn't be here.
Events that penned an anthem by singer Neil Young. Polls at the time showed most Americans blamed the demonstrators, not the guard.
I want you to meet my fiancée.
Another emerging talent brought a whole new level of violent realism to the screen. His name was Sam Peckinpah. He liked drinking, women, and brawling with studio executives. His violent lyricism would change movies forever. The Wild Bunch was, in part, an allegory for America's increasingly violent involvement in Vietnam. But fortunately, the violence of the new cinema, in Hollywood at least, had been limited to the screen. And for most of those at the top of the emerging new Hollywood, life was a non-stop party with an unending flow of beautiful women and men eager to explore the new sexual freedom that was enhanced and encouraged with the best drugs money could buy. Everybody knew everybody else, and it seemed like the high would last forever. Then on the morning of August 9th, 1969, Charlie Manson's followers broke into Roman Polanski's house in Botanic Canyon and butchered Polanski's pregnant wife, Sharon Tate, and 4 others, while the director was away in Europe. Rumors flew of orgies and drug abuse.
At the 1972 Academy Awards, the Best Picture nominations included Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange, Peter Bogdanovich's The Last Picture Show, and the offbeat crime thriller The French Connection, which lent a European edge to a classic American narrative, and whose Best Picture victory was seen as confirming the arrival of the so-called New Hollywood. William Friedkin was hailed as a wunderkind, and inaccurately but appropriately declared to be the youngest filmmaker ever to win the Best Director Oscar. But Friedkin's glamorous triumph had its roots in a more down-to-earth victory, achieved 10 years earlier by two New York policemen, Eddie Egan and Sonny Grosso, who had laughingly imagined themselves to be movie stars as they pulled off one of the biggest drug busts in American history.
Obviously, it really was a wake-up call as to just how much drugs was coming into the United States and how much money, was involved.
We found out that this operation had been smuggling 50 kilos every 6 weeks for 25 years.
It turned out to be the largest drug seizure that had ever been made. It had international ramifications. It weighed about 64 pounds. It could have been stepped on. It probably was worth about $220 million, all in one seizure.
Well, I was very interested in how cops worked, and the only way to really know that is to be with them and to step into their shoes.
That's the way Billy is. He's a stickler for that credibility and the specifics, and what he finds interesting, he'll inject it right into a script.
Billy stayed day and night, made the arrest, saw the process, saw the drugs, helped in the seizure, went through the doors. We spoke to informants. Billy was with us. We went to court. Billy was with us. So that by the time Billy Friedkin was ready to make The French Connection about New York City detectives, Billy Friedkin was a New York City detective.
There was a sense that film criticism was part of the movement, and that that film critics were there at the barricades, with the sort of political message of Godard and Weekend and La Chinoise, and it seems rather preposterous today to think of a film critic as part of a political movement, but clearly that's how a lot of us thought of ourselves.
But even as the critics helped bring audiences back into the theaters, the studios were beginning to understand what kind of film could really bring in the dollars.
It opened in New York, and it did very well in New York, but then literally in the 5th or 6th week that they'd been working it, The Exorcist came out, and that just kind of sucked up all the Warner Brothers oxygen, and that was it. That's where they were going to take their energies.
With The Exorcist, Warner Brothers duplicated Paramount's Godfather strategy, opening the picture all over the country on hundreds of screens. The Exorcist was Billy Friedkin's second hit after the hugely successful French Connection, and he joined the growing list of directors who could do no wrong. Hollywood now belonged to the auteurs. Eagerly grabbing up these new media stars, Paramount's Charlie Bluhdorn set up the Directors Company with William Friedkin, Francis Coppola, and Peter Bogdanovich, ignoring growing industry concern about inflated directorial egos.
It was a signal to the industry that the producer could be pushed off to the side, and the directors were the people that would be charged with the responsibility of making the picture. Nobody ever suggested the director wasn't the director of the movie, but then nobody should complain when you give him 100% freedom about why the pictures are costing so much or why they're not talking to the studio. And I think that was a terrible mistake.
As the budgets and egos grew, a self-righteous sense of artistic entitlement began separating Hollywood from the rest of the outside world, which at that moment was exploding. U.S. involvement with the war was still expanding, and the ghettos were still aflame.
Watergate is a scandal in American history that resulted in the downfall and eventual resignation of Richard Milhous Nixon. Richard Nixon ran for his second term in 1972, and he did not want to lose. He lost in 1960 to JFK. He won in a squeaker in 1968, so 1972 was going to be different. And he had a bunch of people that worked for him, and their nicknames, aptly enough, were the Creeps, the Committee to Re-elect the President. And basically what occurred is, whether Nixon knew in the beginning or not, I don't know, but it was a plan to infiltrate the Democratic offices at the Watergate Hotel, to basically steal their stuff, to find the nitty-gritty, to find the dirt, and to win the election. Unfortunately, the burglars were caught, and even though Nixon trounced in 1972 and won that re-election, it was after that election, through the trials of these burglars, where it became known that they were working for the White House. The Watergate scandal is really about a cover-up rather than the actual burglary, and whether or not Nixon was using his powers in the office of the presidency to basically hide this scandal. When it came known that Nixon had recorded many things in the White House, there was a subpoena issued for these tapes. Nixon refused to give those tapes over, claiming executive privilege. This became the trial, Nixon versus United States, where a unanimous court forced him to give those tapes over. And this is the magic words right here: nobody, Mr. President, is above the law and the Constitution. When Nixon had to give those tapes over, he knew the gig was up, so he quit. He got out of town. So there you go, guys. Now you know a little bit about Watergate.
200 channels and nothing to watch? That wasn't always a problem in America, because we didn't always have 200 channels. Everything changed when cable was born. Back in the 1940s, broadcast television was transforming the country. TV signal was transmitted from local towers to rabbit ear antenna, but reception was a hit or miss. Not everyone could get a signal. So, a few enterprising Americans found a workaround. One of them being John Walson, a TV salesman in rural Pennsylvania. Walson put an antenna on a hilltop and ran a wire down to his TV store. The idea of cable was born. By 1952, these community antennas serviced 14,000 cable subscribers in 70 different places nationwide. And unlike local broadcasters, antenna operators could pick up signals from far away, allowing cable customers to access new content. In 1972, Charles Dolan launched Home Box Office, or HBO. 4 years later, in 1976, Ted Turner founded what would become TBS, and later created CNN. The cable industry gave rise to new titans, who took advantage of satellite technology to reach larger audiences. By the 1990s, cable took off, and there were millions of subscribers to dozens of cable companies across the country. Cable reached millions of American households for decades. And then the internet arrived.
In the 1970s, 9 out of 10 households had a TV, making TV one of the most influential products on the market. TV programming grew to represent the diversity of America and the changes that were occurring across the nation. Television programming began to highlight social issues for Americans. Shows like Chico and the Man showed what life was like in a Mexican-American barrio in East LA. The highest rated show in the 70s, All in the Family, showed working class values and dealt openly with the division of classes in American society. The Mary Tyler Moore Show highlighted what it was like to be a working woman in a big city. And the TV miniseries Roots showed the dark history of African-American slavery that prior to this seemed taboo to talk about. All of these shows are classics that you can still view in syndication on TV today. But one show got to start October 11, 1975, and still running today. Saturday Night Live was and is an iconic show that still is a voice for many Americans.
But now, I look back at the 70s and I find things that they were really very good. The great stuff from the Eagles, ZZ Top,
Stevie Wonder, Fleetwood Mac, Frank Zappa, Sly and the Family Stone, Little Feat,
Bob Marley,
Leonard Skinner,
Roxy Music,
Rod Stewart,
Led Zeppelin, Marvin Gaye,
Aerosmith, Bob Seger,
Elton John.
I started in the 70s, for Christ's sakes.
What a healthy time it was for music, and there was this huge circle, 360 degrees of each degree being a different musical category. It's wonderful.
And it just got to be more music. You know, it used to be you had to be pretty big to make an album. But suddenly there were albums by people I'd never heard of.
I really believe that in the 70s, it was a great combination of fashion, artistic sense, songwriting. It was an incredible time.
Musically, it just seems like the 70s, everything was an excuse for a party.
We're just having a party.
It was okay to have a lot of money. It was okay to flaunt it.
Everybody had an airplane.
Beautiful women anytime you wanted it.
Then came the cocaine, then came the booze.
Jack Daniels.
Cognac. Budweiser.
Don't ever drink anything that you can't see through.
Nobody knew that everything was bad for you yet, or that could cause you to crash your car, or you're going to have to go to rehab for that one, you know, and on and on. It was a great time to be alive.
So we had to find a new music, and to me, the tempo of blues, right in the middle of rock and roll, you know, midway point is funky music. You know, it's not fast like rock and roll, and it's not all the way slow like the blues, but it's basically the same 3 chord changes.
Hey, everybody funkin' and don't know how. They should have seen the bull when he funked the cow. Funk so hard they saw some smoke. He said, let's get in the bed and funk like folks are laughing at you.
We went back to like James Brown, the 2/4 thing, and just a basic groove. You couldn't define exactly what it was, so we call it funkadelic.
Ain't nothing but a party, y'all. Let's get it on.
Sometimes the events of decades can crystallize in a moment, and it seems as if overnight there's this historic change. When you look back at it, you say, oh, well, this was building up, and for years there was this person and this person and this group, and they were networking and this, and then there was a shift. The women's movement had many origins. In part, it owes its renewed birth to the civil rights movement, because there was then a lesson for the women of America of how blacks at that time were taking their life into their own hands.
This experience, which Black Americans were having, did not go unnoticed by the rest of America. Something had started that was beginning to spread, a new kind of pride, identity, and consciousness that was about to turn the mass movements of the 1960s into new and different forms of activism.
Now, we fought the public accommodations fight 10 years ago with the blacks. Are we going to have to start all over again with women?
How about, would you like a sign up there that said blacks only or whites only?
It's the same principle, sir. Women are persons. Women are people.
Persons, and we want to be able to come and go through it, and we don't want to be intimidated by signs that say men's buffet.
Married men can still be free, but a woman, what is she? A servant with no pay for life, just so she can stay a wife. A status symbol with a ring, tell me what that's gonna bring. A legal right to bear his kids while liberation he forbids. So ladies, drop the kitchen mop and we'll be heard somehow. Men have made a mess of things, they should be stopped by now.
By 1974, North Vietnamese troops had violated the Paris Peace Accords and renewed their assault on the South. It was clear the Republic of Vietnam would fall. In April of '75, North Vietnamese troops approached the southern capital of Saigon. President Gerald Ford ordered all U.S. troops and citizens out of the country.
Permit the movement of refugees to the area of their choice.
And on April 29th, Armed Forces Radio began playing White Christmas to signal an evacuation was underway.
I'm dreaming of a white Christmas.
Captain Gerald Berry was assigned to rescue U.S. Ambassador Graham Martin. The mission evolved into an 18-hour day of shuttling people to an armada of ships waiting in the South China Sea. And as Berry flew toward the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, he could see enemy tanks approaching the city.
I'm embarrassed that the United States of America is being humiliated and is leaving an area that we had come to defend, and we've been defeated.
When I landed at the San Francisco airport, I was spit on. I was called a baby killer.
Well, it hurt everybody's feelings. People were against the war, so they were against us, basically.
And I couldn't never understand that.
So I went in the men's room, took off my uniform, threw it in a garbage can, and put on civilian clothes to wear the rest of the way home.
And all we were doing is a job that we were asked to do. We don't hold it against American people.
I built a prison around myself. Put up the walls and I wouldn't let anybody else in and I wouldn't let myself out.
When I got back from Vietnam, I couldn't laugh anymore. Jokes were not funny. I became so taken with the experience that I had been through that I thought I'd never laugh again. And I seldom do.
I've had people tell me, man, wash that out of your mind. That's in the past. Forget that. It's just not a thing that you say, all right, wake up one morning, I'm gonna forget it's gone. You know, don't think about it. It doesn't happen like that.
You got to remember there's a saying amongst the Vietnam vets, and that is, we all get killed in Vietnam. We just haven't died yet.
After going through a tough war, it can be really hard to adjust to regular life. So it's no surprise that someone might start feeling lost and lonely, not knowing their purpose anymore, and these feelings can lead to depression and laziness. But what if these feelings eventually reach a breaking point and turn into violence? What happens then? Even though Taxi Driver was made about nearly 50 years ago, its themes still feel relevant today. The movie really nails the feelings of existential pain, trauma, and alienation, and it also does a great job of addressing loneliness, which is something many of us struggle with but might not want to admit. Travis Bickle is undoubtedly one of the most iconic characters in cinema history, a man who fought in the Vietnam War, then came back and became a taxi driver, having a hard time getting things back on track, has no friends, no purpose, and just no motivation to do anything about it. It's like he's stuck in a rut and can't seem to find a way out. Taxi Driver still holds its influence even today, and it actually inspired many other films and pioneered the concept of the anti-hero in cinema. An anti-hero is different from the typical hero. Instead of being all charismatic and having all the answers, they're often flawed and troubled. Even if Travis tries to be a hero, deep down, he's more of an anti-hero. And unlike classic heroes, the characters like him can do something different. They can make us empathize.